and also to the same combatella. Some Neji Tongi, and Rang, Sing, Noncha, Ben, Long, so Davihimato, Meva, the Senate Tongi, Demba Madrupa, then Papa.
When we heard the instruction about how to give rise and how to nurture the enlightened attitude, we were told that there are phenomena and appearances which are objects of our sensory fields, of our perceptions, yet that these are free of any self-nature, that all of these appearances and phenomena which are so seemingly real lack any inherent self-nature unto themselves. Having been instructed in such a way that all these phenomena and appearances which we constantly perceive are of an illusory, dreamlike nature, free of any self-nature unto itself, we may then ask, what about the consciousness that perceives itself, that does the perceiving of all of these objects? And then we continue here with the actual root verses by Chakabayesha Dorje, in which it says, examine this awareness, this consciousness, as to its being free of any origination. Having heard this, we are instructed now to continue to examine that consciousness which does all of that perceiving, that consciousness which is aware of all of these various objects of perception. We have to examine what the nature of that consciousness itself is. Generally speaking, when we are perceiving objects, appearances, and phenomena of whatever type, our consciousness is always directed outwardly. Whatever reactions may appear as a result of the perception of whatever object we are also equally aware of. But what about this consciousness or this awareness itself that does all of that perceiving? This inner awareness, which for the main part is directed outwardly, is to be examined as well, in very much the same way as all of these outer objects which appear so seemingly real. So when we then proceed to look at that consciousness of ours, we might, for instance, examine it as to whether or not it has a color. We might examine whether it is white or blue or yellow or red or green or possibly black or combinations thereof. And as much as we examine, as much as we look at it, we will clearly find that there is no such thing as a color where this consciousness of ours is concerned. It is not endowed with any such characteristic. Similarly, we might continue to examine this consciousness of ours as to whether or not it has a shape. If we want to look at it, we could look at it in such a way as to make out whether it is either square or round, whether it is semicircular or triangular, whether it has a certain length or a certain breadth, or anything of of that kind. And again, as before, if we examine closely, we will clearly come to see that this consciousness of ours does have no such characteristic. It does not have any particular shape or size whatsoever.
Pandita semdala kado gechani jong madru, yu gechani jong madru jing. Tate kado yu kisawa te jung kong yo ma re, dambo ni trupdan yo ma. Trupdan me be jung sing kanyan, dambo semda maji ba re, sardo ma jong ma re. Maji pe rong yi. Ye ne maji pe rong yi ye na, te la yab do kado se me magu ba, te ye sen na yab do kado yo ma re.
So if we examine in this way and clearly conclude that this consciousness of ours has neither color nor shape or any other such characteristic, then we may come to understand that this consciousness from the very beginning is free of any origination. There's no particular point in time at which we could definitely point and say this is when consciousness started. There is no such thing. This consciousness is unoriginated, and this being the case, it can safely do without color or shape.
Yang ngarang kesan saya papa tang dan rawan la nian tu da ji tong de la yu ne yo ma le. Yang ngarang ke jo la, yang ngarang gong bei ke tel la, da kan la da ji tang la zan ne be ge yo de yo ma le. De yin du ba de ne ba me ba.
Having in this way ascertained that this consciousness of ours has no origination, we might examine as to whether this consciousness exists at the present moment, anywhere, at any particular point, either within or without. We could, for instance, think and have a good look whether this consciousness of ours exists anywhere inside of our bodies, anywhere within our limbs or within our inner organs, or anywhere for that matter. And we would, however much we would examine, we would find that there is no such place within our bodies at which this consciousness is to be found. That being the case, we could then reason that, well, if it's not inside, it must be somewhere on the outside. It could either be above our heads, or it could be below the soles of our feet, or it could be somehow in any which way we wrapped around ourselves. But again, if we were to examine closely, we would find that equally this is not the case. So on the one hand, we're being told that this consciousness is without origination, and furthermore we are also being told that at the very present moment it is free of any particular dwelling place. And then there remains, of course, the final question, which is, where does consciousness go? Where does it end? Where does it come? Where does it cease? For instance, if a thought appears within our minds, we might wonder, how does this thought come to an end, and where does it go? What happens to it when it's gone? And equally, in the same manner as before, we could examine this consciousness, this thought activities of ours in this way, and we would come to find very clearly that nor is there a beginning, nor is there a dwelling place, and neither is there a place where it disappears to. There is no particular location anywhere where this consciousness, this thought activity of ours disappears to, where it ceases to be. It is rather the case that consciousness appears out of itself and subsides into itself. Very much like the analogy of waves that appear on the surface of the ocean and also subside into this ocean again.
니저제 리바 송주데 다 샘다 담보 제와 매바 담보 마지바 아도 네베 열요만 타말랑 걸로그 열요마데 제와 가바 네바 송가게 다르와 네 장과 네 상에 다르게 생기 인도 다 대다버야나 너는 상대 얘는 마주바 얘는 매반다고 변나 반농데 반농 동바려와 달라가 요마 속동 카둘라가 요마 된다와이래 상나 된다와 요마래 되네 감마바롱송도지 예바마인 자외 장마지 샘데 요마 말에 옆동 카둘라서 송지기 좀 마지 봐 옛나요 매바마인 콘디간지 제 송도 다 된다와 매바마이 샘데 요래 콜웨게 예동
Having, by way of thorough examination, concluded that this consciousness of ours has neither origination, nor dwelling, nor cessation, we could conclude, furthermore, that this consciousness is just a big nothing, an emptiness, like a black hole. Yet, also that is not the case. We could, for instance, think if it is truly free of any of such characteristics, then it is like empty space in front of us, which is free of containing anything in particular. But again, that is not the case. And concerning this particular point, the great third Karmapa Ranjung Dorje has said accordingly, again from his, here comes a quote from his famous Mahamudra aspiration, it is not existent. No, it is not existent because even the victorious ones of the 3 times have not seen it. So now we might think, well, here's the proof. Even they have not seen it, therefore it is not, it does not exist. But before we hold this to be a proper conclusion, then Karmapa Ranjung Dorje goes on to say, it is also not non-existent, because it is the basis for everything in samsara and nirvana. Whatever appears and exists within samsara and nirvana, whatever conceivable thing or phenomena, is based upon this consciousness.
and Kadu Chani, Tongdova, Hatini Tambo, Jewa map, Bardo Nibam, Tangapam, Ronginka, and Talk Chenny, Tangipa Semtela, Tendawa Hinto, Wuzon, Talk Chapa Jinsi, Musepatatela, Pentetai, Jegum Somari.
Now, being endowed with all this information about how this consciousness is, or rather not is, we could then actually continue on the basis of these, of all of these points, to truly examine it. We could do so along the lines of which we have already heard. We could examine it as to whether or not it has an origination, as to whether or not it has any particular form of dwelling place while doing so, as to whether or not it has color, shape, or whatever characteristics, and we could examine it as to whether or not it has any particular place of or mode of cessation. In this way, we could, in a very intellectual way, examine, analyze this. And it is said that this particular kind of analytical proceeding is the way of the great scholars, of those who go about it in a scholarly and intellectual way. And accordingly, this particular kind of practice is also known as the analytical meditation of a scholar or Pandita.
Papa Lodru Sumbu, Omaka Gora, Sopa Tangi, Tahinki, Tigetana, Young Tapa, La. Tigetana, Young Tapa, then you woman dancing campo, not then he say no one that Tangi, Demba Madru, but then a public ripa. Then he think that nothing get ripa, and the Ripa Mombo, your Omaka ripa. Tenga Rikpa Tanki, the young Tapa, Hapni, that say no one that Tanki, but the Trumandu, at them Madu Parindo, Sangre Nojarindo, some touch a shake apart, and Omagatan, Tahinki.
Now, if we were to practice accordingly, if we were to adopt the various means of such analytical meditation of the Panditas, as it is called, then we could become a great deal more thorough by way of examining all of these points. We could do so, for instance, according to the various tenets of the so-called Madhyamika school, the school of the middle or the intermediate way, in which there are a great deal of logical reasonings and arguments which argue the empty nature of appearances and phenomena, and which bring about, which give us all sorts of reasonings and ideas to think about, to dwell on, about why, how things are like this and not in any other way. They are known as the various types of conclusions, the 5 great conclusions, the 7 conclusions, and so forth. All of these are being named differently. But all of these various different kinds of reasoning, of logical arguing, of examining, etc., they all aim at one and the same thing, which is predominantly to make us understand that all appearances and phenomena as we perceive them, all of this which seems so seemingly real to us, is truly nothing else but free of any self-nature and truly originates within that non-existent consciousness of ours.
Madrupa, Tambo Cheva Map, Pardon, Neba Map, Tangapa Map, Rongi, Jango, Nisam de Rongi, Letari, Queen, that condition, those some taught Cheney, and Sazun, your Damba Mad, Malam Tava, Yumata, Monzembeke, Sendayum, Damba Madru, and that Tetra Gamona, and Yambariani, Gambar Seba, Tatela, and he painted Tai, Jagum.
Based on all of these points, we then could proceed to examine our consciousness further, to truly find out about its true nature. And if we were to do so, we could, for instance, take into account the words of the great third Karmapa, which yet again come from his famous Mahamudra aspiration, in which he says, "Consciousness is not existent as consciousness. It is free of any such characteristics." In the same way as if we were to, we were to examine our consciousness, we could also proceed to examine all other appearances and phenomena, and we would invariably come to find them to be free of any self-nature, of any intrinsic nature or reality whatsoever. Whatever it is that appears to our consciousness, down all the way to that consciousness itself, is free of any characteristics, free of any self-nature, free of any anything that we could make it out to be in particular. It has neither shape, it has neither color, it has no origination, dwelling, or cessation in any which way whatsoever.
Say your Tamji Damba Madruma, Tumba, Ten Zambar Sepe, Sayu Damba Madruma, Tumba Yena, then Tumba la Kayon Pene Kayon Mendu, Deva Dramna, Tamji Tumbari, Tika Panto Kayon, so much. Digba Sena Yang, Tamji Tumbari, Tika Kayon Napa Yunga Mendu, Tenda, Sana Shar Sigiri. Tenda Sharzona, that Diki Nimbola, and then I
forgot to say before, all of this analytical reasoning, all of this examining in the prescribed way, that is generally that which we know under the heading of analytical meditation, or the analytical meditation of the Pandita. Now, having understood all of these points, having come to the conclusion by way of logical reasoning and examination that truly all objects of perception down all the way to our own bodies are truly empty, having understood that also that consciousness of ours is empty, and everything else for that matter as well, that nothing whatsoever has any self-nature unto itself, well, then we could think, well, everything is empty, therefore there is no benefit, therefore there is no harm. How could there be? Because all of that is empty as well, isn't it? Now, to reason in this way, to think in this way is altogether possible, and once we have concerned ourselves with all of these things, indeed it would be not too surprising if such a thought would creep up within our minds. However, that would be a wrong idea. And why that would be a wrong idea, which he will explain forthwith. So that kind of thoughts happening would just be a very natural thing. We would think everything is empty, therefore all benefit is empty, all harm is empty, so what's the point in anything at all? When such a thought appears within our minds, then that thought is to be regarded just like any other thought, just like any other perception. It is to be regarded just as anything else, and it is to be recognized as also being empty, free of any nature, being truly non-existent. And if we examine in this way also that kind of thought, then this kind of thought will dissolve back into itself, will dissolve back into wherever it has come from, and what remains then is nothing but the remaining in mind nature itself. Now this may serve as a short introduction into the salient features of that which we call analytical meditation.
Kusala Yogante and Ipan Doksur Tamba Jatan Tenga Serve Yornosan Daji Kayan Meva Jatan Lamaron Sand Yemi Sini then send Matu Baron Yavate Kusala Yogam Tati Sode Tamba.
This leads us now with the explanation of the experiential meditation of a so-called simple practitioner, a so-called Kusula, who simply rests in the recognition of the nature of true reality. Setting all of these analytical reasonings and analysis, etc., aside, we simply rest in the natural state. And the root verse to this, which describes this, says, simply rest in the in the essence of the natural state. What this means is that without going into all of these examinations, without examining by way of all sorts of logical reasonings, etc., as Panditas, as scholars, as learned persons would do, we simply rest in the nature of true reality by way of first having prayed to our teachers, as has been explained right at the beginning, having imagined the teacher to be truly present above our heads, praying to him, having him dissolve into our heart center, and in this way merging our mind streams with that of the teacher. We then simply proceed to rest in that state without any further ado, without any elaboration, and experience that very state itself.
Tatiga Sherab make Sherab Yola Zantambo, Ombo, Dan Penny, Yorin, the ages of Ombu Galan, make a number of your Zan. 다 대예지서 나에 조카 양바 송니까 이제 넘버 시반좀 다대 요런 희성든지 두고서라 주 조와당 되니 깎아서 주 도와라서 된디당 잘와서 다 된다고 그 말이에요. 나기초 된게 열라 조도라서 봐도 잘하는.
In order to describe this particular experiential type of meditation of a Kusala, then the text continues to say that what is meant here, this resting in this natural state, is the being free of all the different types of perceptual activity of our sensory abilities and the sensory fields. Talking about these, there are the 5 normal ones of seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting and touching. On top of that there is a 6th one, which is the mental consciousness itself, and the 7th one, which is the ability or the tendency to retain that which we have perceived, as well as all the various kinds of reactions that we have given rise to. Resting within this kind of nature, this is not what is meant here. Not the kind of activity that lets us give rise to a whole train of thoughts or activities or concepts. For instance, if we see an object with our eyes, then immediately we start to examine it as to its nature. We start to judge it by way of whether it is desirable or undesirable, and we give rise to all sorts of ideas and concepts, etc. This is not what is meant here. When all of this activity concerned and connected with all the various types of perceptory activity, etc., has come to rest, when all of this has come to complete peace, has become inactive. This is the kind of resting in the natural state, free of any such activity that is being meant here. This particular state, having come to rest in this state, simply experiencing its natural, the natural state of things, the natural state of our own mind nature. This is also that which is known under such terms as Buddhanature, Tathagata, which is the potential for awakening itself. This is what we're talking about here. Now we may ask ourselves of what kind of nature is this natural state, this Buddha nature in which we're supposed to be resting continuously. And then Contra Loditaya, commenting upon these words, goes on to say that this state is completely free of any elaboration in the way of thinking of it in terms of being either existent or non-existent, or not non-existent, or neither existent nor non-existent. It is free of any such elaboration whatsoever. There is no such particular characteristic that could be dubbed onto it, and to remain just within that state. This is what is to be done. This is exactly what we have to rest in. Within this natural state that is completely beyond any characterization, which is completely beyond being graspable in any way whatsoever. It is completely beyond the province of thinking or reasoning or characterizing. If we were to try to describe that nature with words in any which way soever, we would miserably fail, because it is completely beyond any such characterizations in any which way. To simply rest in that natural state, to do so while remaining aware, this is what is to be done, this is what is to be trained in this particular kind of practice. Now, even though we might be resting in that state, invariably, at some time or other, thought activity will start again. Out of this empty natural state, all of a sudden there will be a thought. Now, what is to be done at that particular point? Or rather, what is not to be done at this particular point? What we should not do is allow this thought to produce a further train of thoughts. Instead of looking at that thought and thinking further thoughts as a result of that thought, we should just simply look into the essential nature of that thought, which will cause that thought to seize back into itself, rather than allowing ourselves to be carried away by a thought which produces further thoughts and ideas and concepts which distract us from looking, from resting in this natural state. We simply look at the natural state of the thought itself, allow it to dissolve back into itself, and remain to rest within the natural state. At the end of such a session, we are again called upon to train ourselves in the 7 branches or the 7 activities which we have already heard of initially, which are those of performing prostrations, of confessing our misdeeds, rejoicing in the merits of others, requesting the great leaders and sages to turn the wheel of the Dharma, to remain within this world of ours in order to guide beings like ourselves, and finally then to dedicate whatever merit has been accumulated through such meritorious, virtuous activity. This is how we should bring such a session to a close. This is how the actual meditation session would be brought to conclusion. And then, once we have done that, we proceed to that which is called the post-meditation period, the period between formal meditation sessions. Where these are concerned, it is said that we should be like the offspring or the child of illusion, in such a way that we carry the recognition of that which we have practiced in our formal session into our normal everyday activities. We remind ourselves in whatever it is that we're doing and whatever it is that we are about, that the nature of all of that which we perceive, the nature of all of that which we do is truly illusory, is truly non-existent. There is no inherent self-nature onto anything of that self, anything onto itself, to any of this. In this way, we are called upon to either practice, as has been explained initially, according to the analytical meditation of a scholar by way of logical reasoning and examination and analysis of whatever it is that we perceive, all the way down to our own mind natures, and finally to proceed, after having done so, to simply rest in the natural state, which is nothing but the Buddhanature itself, and simply perceive whatever it happens in its empty natural state itself. This is the ways how one would go about such practice, both in the actual formal session as well as in all the periods of time which lie between such sessions. And this is exactly what is to be done between sessions, not only while we sit and perform the actual formal meditation session, but also while we find ourselves between two such sessions. Everything that we perceive, everything that we do, everything that pops up in our minds, every conceivable situation is to be looked at as dreamlike, is to be looked at as completely illusory in nature, free of any self-nature, free of any inherent existence out of it or onto itself. So this idea, this kind of looking at things and viewing activities, appearances, phenomena as dreamlike, as illusory, is to be maintained in whatever we do, whenever we do it. And this may serve now as a very brief introduction or description of how to give rise and how to nurture the enlightened attitude of Bodhicitta, which is in accord with true reality. Tomorrow we will then proceed to hear about how to give rise to Bodhicitta and how to keep it up in accord with the world of phenomena and appearances. Now, this is all about loving kindness, compassion, all about our daily dealings and wheelings, and there is nothing much difficult to understand concerning these points, because it deals very much with the world as we perceive it, as we hold it to be real. Therefore, the easy part follows tomorrow. Now, if there are any questions concerning the points Rinpoche has talked about, we have time for a few of these.